Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
If you're one of the millions of people who struggle with chronic insomnia, you probably know this exact moment. The clock hits 3 a.m., and suddenly you are just intensely awake.
It's not even that you can't sleep, it's that your brain just decided to hit the gas pedal.
Exactly. You're running this full-speed marathon of anxieties, problems, to-do lists, and you just can't find the brake pedal. That feeling, that inability to hit the mental off switch is really the core of the whole struggle.
And for a long time, the thinking was that this racing mind was, almost exclusively linked to things like stress or anxiety, the idea that you've almost trained yourself to panic when you get into bed.
A conditioned response.
Exactly. But what if that feeling, that hyperarousal, that sort of relentless engine noise in your head was less about that and more about a fundamental biological timing error deep inside the brain?
And that shift in thinking, from psychology over to physiology, is really the core of what we're going to break down today. We're looking at some landmark research from the University of South Australia that gives us some really concrete, measurable evidence that this failure to switch off is actually rooted in a disruption of the brain's natural 24-hour rhythm.
Right. This research team, they took on an incredibly difficult task, which was to map the precise fluctuations in how the mind works, what it's thinking, how it's structured, across an entire day in people with chronic insomnia.
And by doing this under these super controlled conditions, they could actually isolate the internal biological clock, that circadian rhythm.
And that let them show why some people's minds stay in that D-time mode well into the night. It really gives us this powerful new idea that the racing mind is fundamentally a timing issue. It's a clock that's running on the wrong schedule and maybe with not enough strength.
And this is so relevant. I mean, insomnia is not some fringe condition. It affects something like 10% of the population.
Mm-hmm. And that number just skyrockets as we get older. It hits nearly a third of older adults.
And for that group, the main complaint isn't usually falling asleep, it's staying asleep. It's that 3 a.m. wake up where the mind just refuses to disengage. Researchers have called this cognitive hyperarousal for a long time, but their mission here was to figure out, is this just a symptom of worry, or does it come from a real fundamental abnormality in the biological clock itself?
Which is such a critical question. Because if it is a clock malfunction, the way we've been treating it, mostly focused on anxiety and conditioning, might need a complete rethink. We might need totally new tools.
So the study we're really digging into is called Cognitive Affective Disengagement, 24-Hour Rhythm in Insomniacs versus Healthy Good Sleepers. And it was published in Sleep Medicine. The thing that makes this paper a landmark study is just how incredibly rigorous the method was. It was designed to surgically cut through all the noise of insomnia symptoms and just isolate the core biological drivers.
You have to, because insomnia is just notoriously complex to study. When someone can't sleep, the cause can be a mix of at least 3 different things. And you need to know which one you're looking at.
Okay, so let's unpack those 3 potential causes, because understanding them is absolutely key to seeing why they designed the experiment the way they did.
Absolutely. So the first factor you could be looking at is what's called a trait-like vulnerability. This just means that the person is, predisposed to having a really active mind, high executive function maybe. It's just part of who they are, no matter the time of day.
So it's just their baseline.
It's their baseline. The second factor is the one we mentioned, the conditioned response. This is the classic behavioral model, the anxiety that builds up specifically when you get into your bedroom and you start to associate your bed with failure and being awake.
And the third one?
The third is a fundamental time of day or circadian phenomenon. This means the body's internal 24-hour clock is just misaligned or maybe too weak. And that's the problem, regardless of your stress level or where you are.
So the big challenge for the scientists was, how do you design a test that only measures number 3, the circadian part, while completely getting rid of the anxiety from number 2 and the baseline trait from number 1?
Precisely. And to do that, they use this incredibly restrictive protocol. It's called the constant routine. And this is where the research really shifts from standard sleep science into chronobiology, the study of biological timing.
Tell us about this routine. It sounds pretty intense for the people who participated.
Oh, it is. It's intense by design. They took 32 older adults, 16 with chronic sleep maintenance insomnia, and 16 healthy good sleepers. And they monitored them for a full 24-hour period of wakeful bed rest.
Wakeful? So they weren't allowed to sleep at all?
Not at all. Think of it like sensory deprivation for your biological clock. Participants had to stay awake in a fixed, nearly lying down position in a dimly lit room. The light was kept below 50 lux, which is about what you'd get from a TV screen in a dark room.
And I'm guessing they removed all the time cues.
Every single one. No clocks, no phones, no exercise. Even food and water were standardized, given out in small amounts every 2 hours.
Okay, so the environment is static, the behavior is controlled. Why was it so important for them to stay awake for that whole 24-hour period?
That's the absolute key to isolating the brain's own endogenous rhythm. By getting rid of activity and timed meals and light changes, you remove all the strong external signals that usually set our biological clock.
And by taking away the pressure of trying to sleep.
You remove that conditioned anxiety that's normally tied to the bedroom.
That's right.
That makes perfect sense. So if you hold everything else constant, any fluctuation you see in their mental activity over those 24 hours has to be driven by the body's own internal clock just trying to run on its own schedule.
Exactly. It's the circadian system speaking directly without any interference from daily life or, bedroom frustration. And then they could really measure how that core clock was driving their mental activity.
So what were they measuring every hour? It wasn't just a simple, are you thinking?
Yeah.
It was much more specific. Oh, much more. They use something called the Cognitive Affective Disengagement Checklist. This is where you get the really granular data on the quality and the controllability of their thoughts.
And this checklist was broken down into 2 main areas, tracking 8 different things. The first one was focused on the tone and quality of mentations, basically what the thoughts actually felt like.
Right. So for instance, they tracked thought modality. Was the thinking mostly auditory, like an internal dialogue, or is it more image-based, like seeing pictures in your head?
So like a commentary track versus a silent movie.
That's a great way to put it. Then there was thought structure. And this one is maybe the most important for understanding that racing mind.
Why is that?
Because they were assessing if the thoughts were repetitive or circular, the same few words just going around and around, versus sequential or linear.
And sequential thinking is when one thought leads directly to the next, like you're building a case or a plan.
Exactly. It's goal-directed problem-solving thinking. It's what you want during the day, but it is absolutely lethal for sleep at night.
And they also looked at how grounded in reality the thoughts were.
Yep, that was reality orientation. Were the thoughts about the real world here and now, or were they getting more abstract, fragmented, sort of dreamlike? Which is what you need to happen to fall asleep. And finally, they just measured pleasantness, just the overall emotional feeling of the thoughts.
So that covers the content of the thoughts. But then there was a whole second domain, metacognitive activity, which is about the brain's executive control, how you're managing those thoughts.
Precisely. This is about quantifying the brain's ability to sort of let go of the steering wheel, which is what disengagement is all about. So here, they measured things like volitional control.
Which is how much you feel like you can direct or stop your thoughts.
Right. When it's high, you're in control. When it drops, your mind drifts, which is what you want before sleep. They also measured thought monitoring. That's kind of the internal observer. How much are you noticing and analyzing your own thinking process?
Which sounds like a hallmark of hyper-awareness.
It is. Then external awareness. So how tuned in they were to the lab environment. That should drop at night. And finally, thought recall. How easily could they remember what they were just thinking about? High recall means clear, structured thought. Poor recall means things are getting fragmented, moving towards sleep.
So together, these 8 metrics give you this complete 360-degree view of the mind's inner workings over a full day.
A full day, yes.
So after all that data collection, what did the patterns actually show when they compared the insomniacs to the healthy sleepers?
Well, the first thing the data confirmed was what we could call a universal rhythm. Both groups showed a clear 24-hour circadian pattern in their mental activity.
So everyone's mind has a natural rhythm.
Everyone does. Thought complexity and control would predictably peak in the late afternoon and then hit their lowest point in the early morning. The basic mechanism is there in all of us.
But that mechanism was clearly delivering 2 very different realities for these 2 groups. The healthy sleepers were getting that smooth shift down into a quiet mode. But the insomniacs had what the researchers called the core insomnia deficit, a failure to downshift.
A failure to downshift strongly and on time. And to really get this deficit, we need to talk about 3 key concepts that define a rhythm: measure, amplitude, and acrophase. The difference between a good night's sleep and chronic insomnia really came down to abnormalities in these three things.
Let's use an analogy to make this clear. Say your cognitive rhythm is like a volume knob on a stereo that cycles up and down over 24 hours.
Perfect. So the measure would be the average volume setting, your baseline level of thinking across the whole day. The amplitude is the range, how loud can it get and how quiet can it get. For healthy sleep, you need a really big amplitude so you can turn that volume way, way down at night.
And the acrophase.
The acrophase is the exact time of day when that volume knob is turned up to its absolute loudest peak.
Okay, let's start with the most significant finding. The blunted variation, or what you called a smaller amplitude. What did that mean for the insomniacs?
It means their cognitive state just didn't have a clear difference between day and night. The healthy sleepers showed this really strong, high-amplitude rhythm. They shifted decisively from daytime problem-solving mode to nighttime disengagement mode.
Whereas the insomniacs had a much flatter rhythm.
Much flatter. It was blunted. Think of it like the healthy sleeper has a clear on-off switch for their thinking, but the insomniac only has a very narrow dimmer switch that never really turns all the way off.
So the contrast between their alert time and their quiet time was minimal. It just blurred that crucial boundary.
Exactly right. That blunted amplitude suggests their brain was just getting these weak or unclear internal timing signals, telling it to power down. And this really showed up in two of the most important executive function measures: reality orientation and volitional control.
How much of a difference are we talking about?
Well, with reality orientation, the healthy sleepers had this huge shift towards more abstract, dreamlike thoughts during their biological night. The insomniacs showed way less variation. Their thoughts just stayed stubbornly real-like, focused on real-world problems at all hours.
Which prevents that mental detachment you need for sleep. And the blunted volitional control seems to get right at that feeling of a racing mind you just can't stop.
It really does. The good sleepers showed a strong drop in their ability to direct their thoughts at night. It just happened naturally. The insomniacs showed much less change. Their minds stayed highly controllable, highly directed, right when they should have been drifting. The whole cognitive system was just stuck in its daytime operational mode.
So the signal to downshift was weak. But it wasn't just weak, it was also happening at the completely wrong time. Which brings us to the delayed peaks, or the delayed acrophase. This finding feels like a kind of internal jet lag.
That's exactly what it is. And it explains why people with this kind of insomnia feel wide awake at 11 p.m. or when they wake up at 3 a.m. Their internal clock that governs alertness and peak cognitive function was just completely misaligned.
And what was the specific number here? How big was the delay?
The delay was staggering. The cognitive peaks for the insomniacs, so their period of maximum alertness and goal-directed thought, were delayed by approximately 6.5 hours compared to the healthy sleepers.
6.5 hours. Let's just put that in perspective. If a healthy sleeper's brain is at its peak performance at, say, 4 in the afternoon,
then the insomniac's brain is hitting that same peak at 10:30 at night.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about general alertness. We're talking about peak complex thought, peak executive control. Their internal clock was basically screaming at them to do complex thinking well into the night.
So right at the moment, a healthy sleeper's body is signaling, okay, time to quiet the mind. The insomniac's clock is just hitting go time for problem solving.
Precisely. They are functionally living on a severely delayed schedule. It makes high-quality sleep a biological impossibility until their cognitive rhythm finally hits bottom, which might not be until 5 a.m. or even later.
And then there's the third piece, the elevated baseline, or the higher misera. This suggests that even at their quietest point, the insomniac's mind is still running hotter than a healthy sleeper's.
That's right. Across the whole 24 hours, the insomniacs just had a significantly higher average level of thought structure. It points to a general state of hyperarousal that's independent of the time of day, but it's the quality of that thinking that's so revealing.
This high baseline was characterized by that sequential thinking you mentioned. We should probably expand on that difference between sequential and circular thinking.
It's a really crucial distinction. The healthy sleepers, even during their active daytime phase, tended to report more repetitive or circular thinking, dwelling on a couple of worries, a few things on a to-do list that just kind of cycle. It's annoying, but it doesn't build on itself.
Whereas sequential thinking is the engine of productivity, right?
It is. Sequential linear thought is where one idea leads logically and systematically to the next. You're building a chain of reasoning, you're planning, it's goal-directed, and it requires intense activation of the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center. And what they found was that for the insomniacs, this sequential thinking dominated, and it was elevated all day long. Their minds are just constantly running at this structurally complex and high level.
So if you think of sleep as the brain's ability to disengage from that goal-directed thought, this study provides the biological proof that in insomniacs, that process is just severely broken.
It is. It's broken because the timing is 6.5 hours late, the intensity of the off signal is too weak, and the baseline level of complex, structured thinking is just too high to begin with.
That really summarizes the whole biological breakdown. The persistence of that sequential, goal-oriented thinking, it seems to align perfectly with what's called the cognitive hyperarousal model, insomnia.
It does. It reflects a physiological failure to downregulate the activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain doing all that structured thought right when it should be powering down for the night.
And the implication that this type of thinking, the sequential kind, might be a stable, trait-like vulnerability is a huge takeaway. Because if it's a trait, it helps explain why just managing your stress or your behaviors hasn't fixed the problem for so many people.
Exactly. It suggests the racing mind isn't just a temporary reaction. It might be a built-in cognitive signature. This connects that subjective feeling people have directly to what we've seen in neuroimaging studies, which often show elevated prefrontal activation in insomniacs, even when they're supposed to be resting. The executive system is just stuck in overdrive.
This research has to force a pretty profound shift in how we think about treatment. If the root cause is circadian and cognitive, not just behavioral, then a lot of current therapies might be missing the real target.
This is where we get to move from describing the problem to actually trying to fix it. If the issue is a weak signal and a late signal, then the interventions have to focus on strengthening and resetting that biological clock. This is the world of circadian interventions.
What does that mean specifically? Strengthening the clock. It sounds like you need to give the brain clearer signposts for day versus night.
That is precisely the goal. And the most powerful environmental signpost we have is light. We're talking about timed, bright light exposure, usually first thing in the morning, to essentially pull that delight acrophase earlier. You're telling the internal clock, hey, it is daytime now, forcing that peak alertness to happen earlier in the day.
So you're manually correcting for that 6.5-hour delay.
You are. And you couple that with really structured daily routines, waking up at the same time, eating at the same time, exercising at the same time, and that helps restore that day-night variation, which boosts the blunted amplitude. This is especially relevant for older adults who often have a natural weakening of their circadian signals as they age.
But fixing the timing doesn't necessarily fix that tendency towards sequential thinking. That would require that second category you mentioned, cognitive interventions.
Right. This is where you target that elevated baseline and the structure of the thoughts themselves. The researchers suggest things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapies. The key isn't to try and suppress the thoughts. That just makes the prefrontal cortex work harder. It's about fundamentally changing how your mind relates to them.
So how does mindfulness do that?
It teaches you to have a kind of non-judgmental awareness. So when a sequential thought starts, I have to email Bob, which reminds me I need to call Sue, and if I call Sue, the typical insomniac just follows that chain. Mindfulness teaches you to just observe it. There's a thought about emailing Bob without getting on the train and following it. You interrupt the goal-directed process that keeps the frontal cortex fired up.
So instead of trying to solve the problem in your head, you're just observing the problem-solving process itself, which stops it from escalating.
Exactly. It's much more targeted than just general worry reduction because it addresses the specific structure of sequential linear thinking that the study identified.
These insights really do provide a roadmap for more personalized insomnia treatment. But of course, no study is without its complexities and its limitations, especially one as intense as this. We should probably put on our critical hats for a minute.
Absolutely. And one of the most fascinating complexities they found suggests that the entire biological clock might not be working as one single synchronized unit. This is what you could call the decoupling mystery.
Decoupling. So different parts of the body's timekeeping system are sending out conflicting signals.
That's what it looks like. So the researchers noted that for these exact same participants, another key physiological measure, core body temperature, was known to be elevated. Now, core body temp is controlled by subcortical brain systems, and it's a classic measure of physiological arousal. You would expect arousal and cognition to track each other pretty closely.
Right. High temperature should mean high mental complexity. A hot engine should mean the computer is running fast.
Logically, yes. But here's the really surprising part. Even though their core body temperature was high, only 3 of the 8 cognitive measures, the ones that reflect the more advanced cortical parts of the brain, showed that significantly blunted circadian rhythm.
So the subcortical arousal signal, the high temperature, was strong, but the cortical signal, the mind's attempt to power down, was only partially responding to it.
It suggests a functional decoupling. It's like your car's engine temperature gauge is in the red, showing massive physiological stress, but your GPS and your radio, the cognitive controls, are only glitching a little bit. The master clock's signals to the parts of the brain governing arousal might be behaving differently from the signals sent to the parts governing higher-level thought. They're not perfectly in sync.
That raises so many questions. If cognitive arousal is decoupled from physiological arousal, then just targeting one might not fix the other.
Precisely. It really highlights the complexity here. It's not just one system that's off.
Another critical point comes from the very method we were praising. The fact that the constant routine required people to stay awake. This brings back the conditioned response question.
It was a necessary trade-off.
Yeah.
They had to tell participants to stay awake to isolate the circadian rhythm. But by removing the instruction or the expectation to sleep, they also removed a lot of the negative emotion, the anxiety, the frustration, the fear of failure that insomniacs feel at home when they're actually trying to sleep.
So in a way, the controlled environment might have actually minimized the very problem they were studying.
The researchers themselves suggest this. They think the true difference between the groups might be even greater in the real world. That pressure to fall asleep is a massive amplifier for negative sequential thoughts. By taking that pressure off, the study might have actually underestimated the true cognitive difference between the groups.
And that leads right into the comorbidity challenge. As you'd expect, the insomniacs in the study reported much higher anxiety scores than the good sleepers. And we know anxiety is tightly linked to that kind of sequential thinking and hyperarousal.
So the central scientific riddle is, are these circadian abnormalities something specific to insomnia? Or do they reflect a common mechanism that's shared with conditions like generalized anxiety disorder? I mean, anxiety is practically defined by intrusive, sequential thinking and difficulty with cognitive disengagement. The profiles overlap heavily.
So if the underlying mechanism is shared, then a chronobiological treatment like light therapy might help both conditions. But if they're distinct, the treatments would have to be much more specific.
Right. And we just don't have the data yet from a 24-hour constant routine on people with high anxiety but without insomnia. That's the next critical step to really disentangle these things and create truly precise treatments.
And finally, we should just touch on the limits of generalizability. We need to remember who was in this study.
That's important, yes. The findings are specific to older adults. Their average age was in the mid-60s, and specifically those with sleep maintenance insomnia, the inability to stay asleep. This type of insomnia has a really strong age-related component, and it's often linked to weakening circadian systems.
So that 6.5-hour delay might not be the same for a younger person who has trouble just falling asleep in the first place, though the idea of sequential thinking being a trait might still apply.
Exactly. And of course, it's a relatively small sample size, 16 people in the insomnia group. So we need to see this replicated in larger, more diverse groups to really be confident in how broadly these conclusions apply.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to the big picture. The critical insight here is that for many people, the struggle of the racing mind is really a failure of biological timing and downregulation. It's a biological problem that's been masquerading as a purely psychological one.
For these chronic insomniacs, their biological alertness clock is just signaling awake hours too late into the night. And the amplitude, that ability to shift down into a quiet state, is severely blunted. We really have to stop looking at the racing mind as just a problem of general worry and start treating it as a failure of chronobiological timing.
Which points so strongly to a future of more precise therapy, using circadian interventions like timed light to physically reset the clock, and then using specialized cognitive therapies like mindfulness to interrupt that goal-directed thinking that keeps the front of the brain working past its bedtime.
And that next step is just so crucial, figuring out if these cognitive circadian issues are unique to insomnia or if they're shared with anxiety. That's the key that will unlock the next generation of really effective, precise treatments.
And for you, the listener, maybe the takeaway is to consider the immense power of environmental timing. Your consistent exposure to light, the rigidity of your routines, even when you eat your meals. All of these things are powerful levers that control these deep internal biological processes. This knowledge could fundamentally reshape how you think about preventing or treating that struggle to disengage at night. The brain is running a marathon, and sometimes the solution is just to adjust the starting gun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Do Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.